Hello, Blaine Gray here from Plastering for Beginners, and today we're going to talk about how to finish render, and specifically we're going to talk about how to finish sand cement render. So this is a very typical subjective rendering, but we're going to go into it in a lot more detail. And basically, as a quick recap, the main process of finishing render is using a float to float up the wall flat, and then we sponge it. Before that, you apply the scratch coat. Next day, typically, you then apply the render on top of the scratch coat, rule it off, and then that's where we come to the stage where we're going at now. In today's video, we're going to go specifically onto how to finish it. We're going to go into detail on how to float it, how to sponge it, and where the other videos touch on the subject, we're really going to home in on it. And in particular, a lot of questions I've been getting from the YouTube channel is, what are the timings? When do you use the float? When do you sponge? What's the timings in between? That is something that's going to come up later. I know it's a massive subject, so keep tuned, because at the end of this video, I'm going to clarify on them subjects and give you some real tips on how to discover when and how to float it. So for now, let's get to it. Here's the wall we're working on. We've got a typical situation here. It's been ruled off, it's been applied, and what I'm doing is a touch test. My finger's not going into the wall. It's not completely, if you put your finger in usually and it squidges in, that's a bad time to start. But basically, I'm just quickly giving a wall a light haze of water. And this is what I do just to liven up the render. It just brings the aggregate back to the front. It makes it a lot easier to work with. If I find that if I don't add a bit of water, then it can just be a bit tricky sometimes. Again, I'm only adding a little haze of water, nothing major. Don't really drench it, because what you'll do is you'll wet the render up too far, and it'll create it just to go back to exactly how it was. Floating is a very strange subject, because you need to hit it at like the exact right time. And like I said, I'll go into that later on. But for now, you'll find is what I'm holding the float flat to the wall, holding it quite tight, and with circular motions, what you're doing is you're compressing the render. And the idea is you take away the high spots and you're filling in the low spots where there's areas where there isn't enough render to begin with. And so like I said, you've got to hold your float flat to the wall. I watched another video saying you've got to hold it at an angle. If you hold the float on an angle, what you're going to do is you're going to dig in on the side which isn't above the render. You need to hold it flat. That way you're going to create a flatter surface. If you have an angle on your render, you're going to dig into one side. But as you can see here, you can see where the render's not been filled. The close-up view shows exactly what goes on. You scrape away the high spots. If you can look on the top left, I'm scraping away any areas that are high, and I'm filling any areas that haven't been filled. And as you can see, it's really starting to compress. It's starting to look a lot smoother, and that's because you're just filling in the render a lot more than what it was. When you're working towards the beads, float towards the beads, float into them, and that way you're going to fill the render into the edges of the beads, and it just makes a lot nicer finish. If you do it the other way, you're going to pull the render away from the beads. What we want a nice, clean, tight corner, and that's how you do it. You float towards a bead. As you can see, I'm taking away any high spots. Don't be scared of that. If you feel that your renders, it's pulling stuff off, don't be scared. That's what's happening. But what you will find is the low spots you can't fill anymore. What you do is grab some of the render that you were using before, get it on your float, and you literally just push it in. And then with it, you float it back into the spots where it needs it. Again, it's just the same render. It's the exact same batch what we used to apply it with. Yeah, it might be a bit later on, but add a bit of water if the render's stiff. And what we're doing is the same process. You apply the render to where it's low or where it needs it, and you literally just float it into place. Again, you might have to apply a bit of pressure when you're floating, but the main rule is just make sure the float you're using is flat. On the note on the float I'm using, it's just a small standard float. It's nothing special, but I have had it for about 2 years. What you find at the beginning of using a float, they're absolutely horrible. They're really bad. What I recommend is if you've got a new float, get a concrete block, rub it flat on the block for a good 4 or 5 minutes, and you'll take away that rough texture that's on the top. And I find that just breaks the float in a lot more. And the longer you use the float, the better it becomes, the more you get used to it. So as you can see, I'm still applying the render onto the low spots there. And on the beads, you want to make sure you've got enough on. you're really floating towards that bead and getting it flat and getting it looking nice and ready. And the tops are always quite hard to fill as well. You won't always get that with a rule, so you'll find the tops are quite an area you need to look at. But I need to show you attention to something. Watch this next clip. Stop and watch this now. What you'll find in this part is that I've got an area where it's not quite flat. You can see where the renders, it's not quite acting the same. This is where you either got to take the render off using the float, or you've got to fill it. As you can see, I was actually just scraping a bit of render off with the float then. That's something you might need to do, but don't be scared. Some people are so scared of taking a render off with the float. This is why if you hold it flat to a flat surface, it's got to make sure it's flat all around, because the area before it acts as a rule, almost a guide, and then when you float with it, it makes the whole area flat. So you can see I've actually got to take a bit off. There's an area where you can see where it's not quite the same. So don't be scared to, when you're floating, take the render off with it. It's what happens, it's part of it. And then areas you will need to fill. And what you'll also know is with time you'll start to feel the areas which are higher. You'll feel it with your float. You'll feel the areas that need flattening out, and they're the ones that that's the areas where you need to float the excess render off with. Okay, whilst I've got your attention, let me fill you in on something. If you want to learn an entire process of plastering where we talk about internal work, finish plaster, I'll show you how to mix it, how to apply it, then feel free to sign up to our free welcome course from Plastering with Beginners. It's a completely free system. All you do is sign up via email, and we'll send you videos daily on how to perfect and learn the art of plastering, designed for complete beginners or for anyone who's had a touch on it before but really wants to step up to the next level. So feel free to sign up using the link below, or there's something that's floating about here. And yeah, hope you enjoy it. And for now, let's get back to the rendering. Cheers. And finally, what I'm doing here is I'm cutting back the excess render at the bottom, using your edge of your trowel, and cut it away from your wall. Otherwise, you're going to have big clumps at the bottom. You need to make sure that your bottoms are nice, square and straight. So simply cut it back with the edge of your trowel, and if you need to, float it back in again. Again, float flat to the wall. Literally just float that area flat. If you make sure your edges are nice and clean, this is a massive thing for all renderers out there, so make sure you always do that as well. So that's that, nice and rendered, done now. That's looking nice, flat, most of it's filled, and the next part then is to make sure we get it sponged. So here's the next and final crucial part of finishing the render. It's the final stage, and this is sponging. It's just got a normal double sponge here, bucket of water, and the first thing you do, always, first thing is squeeze that water out of the sponge. You want a dry sponge. Basically, I always float pretty close. I sponge pretty close to after finishing floating. A few people will comment in saying I'm sponging too early. If I find if I leave it too late, that it's just going to cause problems. And again, you really want to make sure you've got a dry sponge. Look, I'm squeezing all that moisture out. I don't want anything in there, because what I do is pretty much after I've floated it, maybe five minutes after, or maybe 10 at the max, I just gently then sponge it up whilst it's still live. And what I'm doing is I'm holding the sponge gently in my hand, really gentle touch to it, and you literally just always try and sponge in the same direction. And I do it anti-clockwise, always do it anti-clockwise, and the main aim is to make sure that you can't see any sponge marks. I had a boss who would always flip if he's seen any sponge marks doing. And if you've got any dirt on the sponge, turn it over and use the other side, which is clean. And you're having such a light touch here, I really mean that. Just gently holding it, and you're just always sponging in the same direction. Make sure you keep it nice and live, and again, because it's dry, you're not going to bring any moisture to the surface of that render. It's literally just going to be floating up, sponging up the floated render already. You don't need to add any moisture, because we've only waited 5-10 minutes. There's nothing to worry about. And what you're doing is gently bringing the aggregate of the sand to the surface. So gentle, light touch. You can't see any sponge marks there, and that's because my hand's holding it so gently. The other thing is always clean the edges of your beads with your sponge. What I like to find is you want to show the tips of your bead. You want to make sure they're on show. It just leaves a nicer impression on the wall. It looks crisp, looks clean. And there's a thing, you don't want to be using a dirty sponge. Always flip it if you've got one side with render on, but never use a dirty sponge. As you can see, what I'm doing is working again. I'm sponging towards the bead again. And that means if there's any areas that aren't filled on the bead, you can gently fill it with your sponge. But you can see I'm not changing direction. I'm always sticking to the anti-clockwise rule. And that's just because keep it consistent. Make sure when you're sponging, keep the same pattern. And look again, and make sure all that moisture is out of that sponge. I don't want anything in there. I want it, again, keeping it in the same direction. And you can see where it's been floated. Where it's been floated, and now it's sponging. It's just really giving it that final crisp finish. And just take your time, really. The worst thing is if you've got a huge area and you try and sponge it when it's been floated and you leave it too late, you find that you can't blend it into the other side. It's very tough to deal with. And one last thing here, the same tip on when we're sponging, always keep your sponge clean. Always clean it out with water. Always. Don't, if it's dirty on one side, put it in a bucket, clean it out, or flip it up, turn it around. We've got to make sure the sponge is always clean. Always keep it in water, keep it clean, and that way you won't get what we call rat tails. Okay, so let's get to the most important part of the video. How do you know when to hit the render? How do you know when to float it? How do you know when to sponge it? So the big thing is there's no actual timings. It's not like internal plastering where we say 20 minutes later, 25 minutes later. It doesn't actually work like that because there's so many factors, like there's weather, there's heat, there's a masonry, different background, you've got block, brick, you've got so many different factors to think about. Even like the wind will affect how fast it sets. But there are signs. So I've got two clips here. And the first one is where I'll show you where it's slightly too wet to start floating. So watch this. This is when it's a bit too soon to render. You can put your finger into the render, it leaves an imprint. And when you do try, it's not too bad, but it pulls. I'm going to give that a bit more time. You can see it's leaving, it's not really staying in place. Let that dry a bit. Okay, so now the next one, this is an extreme where it's way too dry. And this is where you don't really want to be going into this area. You don't want to be floating your render when it's too dry. It's too gritty and it's well too hard to work with. Watch this following clip where I try and float it up and it just looks like hell. Now this one's too dry. It's not leaving a nice consistency, it's not moving. So they're the two extremes. So how do you find the middle ground? Like I said, there's no exact timings, there's no real way of finding out. What I do is a touch test. If you can put your finger into the render without leaving an imprint, then you know it's a good time to start floating. But what I would recommend is just keep trying it. Keep going up to the wall, keep floating it. If it starts to sag, if the render's pulling away, if it's pulling away and leaving areas where it's pulling the render off the wall, you know it's too early. But keep going, and when you will start to float, when it's right, you'll see that actually it stays where it is. The render doesn't move, it doesn't fall off, it just stays in place. So what I recommend the first few times is just test it. After a while, you'll learn when to go to it. You can see it, but at the time, just keep going until that render stays firm, and instead of sagging, it compresses. When it compresses, when it starts filling on itself, that's when you know it's the right time to start doing it. In terms of sponging, like I said in the video, I tend to not wait too long. I like it when the render is freshly floated for me to sponge it, as long as my sponge is really, really dry. So as ambiguous it is, that's the real signs of telling how to and when to float the wall. It's no real timings, but you've just got to know the right point to do it. So if you press in, it doesn't leave an imprint on the wall, It's a good time as long as it's not too dry. So just give it a go and keep doing trials, keep testing and do it for yourself. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like, and if you liked it that much, please subscribe to our channel. It means the world to us. And feel free to leave your comments. What do you think about anything I've put through in this video? And let us know how you get on. Thanks a lot. Blaine Gray, Plastering for Beginners. See you in the next one.